Prime Minister Mark Carney says that Canada can't categorically rule out military participation. Now, those comments are getting a lot of reaction from the opposition today. Conservative defense critic James Bazan says there should be a parliamentary debate in the House of Commons before any type of military involvement. Prime Minister Carney's messaging has kind of evolved since the outset of the war. Carney started by backing the U.S. in their strikes on Iran, but later saying that Canada takes that position, quote, with regret. So why has there been this shift? Well, let's ask our front bench. With us today, our former BC Premier Christy Clark. She's now Senior Advisor with Bennett Jones. Marco Mendicino is the former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Mark Carney and former Liberal Cabinet Minister. He's now Senior Counsel and Strategic Advisor for Castles. Tony Clement served in senior cabinet roles in the Conservative government led by Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He's now the CEO of Tony Clement International, and former federal Conservative Cabinet Minister and MP Monty Solberg. He is now the CEO of New West Public Affairs. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for sticking around through parts of that press conference with Pete Hegseth. Christy, I wanted to start with you. We know that this situation continues to evolve in the Middle East. So do you see this as the Prime Minister changing his message or just adjusting it?
I think events are moving very quickly, and I think everybody's trying to catch up to that. The challenge posed for Canada, I think, is this. We're in the middle of trade negotiations with the United States in a very difficult moment, and I can tell you that when other prime ministers have sat down with presidents in the United States, when there's been a requirement or a suggestion that Canada join a war effort, it has always been a very transactional discussion. So we shouldn't be sitting here thinking, well, you know, should we or shouldn't we? Is it the right thing to do, you know, just because of the war itself, although we should be. It will also be very much in the Prime Minister's mind how this is going to affect our overall relationship with the United States. Now, my view is, I do think that Canada should actively consider being a part of it. Iran has been the worst neighbor in history for everyone in the Middle East. Hezbollah, Hamas, Iraq, Syria, you name it. They've made a mess of the entire region, and they're forming very effective alliances with, people with whom we trade, like China, for example, but who nonetheless don't necessarily have our interests at heart. So it's one of those moments where you look at it as a country and you say, where do our interests lie here? There are very strong domestic interests, I would argue, but I think there's also responsibility to the neighborhood of the world and to the idea of the values and democratic values, the rights of individuals and societies that we also honor and would like to see replicated in more countries around the world rather than fewer. And that's, I think, the question for Parliament to consider and the Prime Minister to consider should he decide to convene the Parliament to discuss it.
Tony, what are some of the risks here? I mean, a lot of them as laid out there by Christy, but as he's pressed to take a position, and as this is continuing to evolve, how difficult is it for him to try and deliver an answer for Canadians and for reporters who are asking those questions, but to make sure that he leaves himself that kind of wiggle room to be able to shift as the conflict continues to shift?
Well, to be honest, I'm getting whiplash observing the Prime Minister with his 3 or 4 different positions on this issue. I think Christy Clark's answer to your question was more concise and cogent and made more sense than what we've heard from the Prime Minister. Christy, kudos to you, but we're hearing, as you're saying, shifting points of view and shifting principles on this issue. So is he getting pressure from caucus members? Perhaps, although he's high in the polls right now. They should be giving him the benefit of the doubt rather than pressing in on something like this. But maybe that's the issue. It could be trying to do this balancing act between our relationship with Donald Trump and the United States versus the middle power philosophy of Mark Carney. But again, it's so bizarre. Just as he's moving away from his initial position, the middle powers like the UK and France are moving towards activity in the region. So it's all a big mess right now, I got to tell you.
Marco, you have served as his as his chief of staff. Do you think he's shifting principles as Tony is sort of laying it out there?
Well, I think he's adjusting, and what we've really put our finger on is just how volatile the situation is. What's causing the whiplash is the war and the conflict. We've been on this panel now for maybe a few minutes. We're now out of date as to what is happening on the ground. So I think we can allot, some understanding to the Prime Minister and the government as it tries to keep pace. But I want to come back to what Christy said, because I thought her intervention was important, and that is, what are Canada's interests as we take the decisions that we are taking to the extent that we are playing a role at all in the Middle East and this conflict. One, for certain, is to support our allies, and there's no doubt that the United States is a strategic and critical ally of ours. The second interest that we have is to defeat terror. And there is incontrovertible evidence that the Iranian regime's single greatest export is terror. So much so that it has killed Canadians, killed thousands of people in the region, and continues to be a challenge when it comes to foreign interference. That is the second interest. And the third interest is to ensure that all of the groundwork that the Prime Minister has been doing in the region with other strategic allies and emerging partners in the Gulf, all of those foreign direct investments which are going to help us increase our sovereign capabilities at home are protected, which is why it is important not to be definitive to the nth degree as the situation unfolds rapidly. Now, I will add one last thing. I agree that anytime Canada contributes the men and women that serve in uniform, that there needs to be a robust debate. And I'm confident that were we to have to take that decision, heaven forbid, that there would be such a debate on the floor of the House of Commons, which is where it belongs first and foremost, and elsewhere. But let's understand that the situation is rapidly evolving, it is volatile, and that is what is causing the whiplash. It is not just simply the words that are coming out of any one head of government.
Monty, how important is that consultation of Parliament? Because if I'm not mistaken, you were an MP the last time Canada was involved in this type of theater in Afghanistan.
It's important, but I just have to go back and respond to the comments of my colleagues. If Donald Trump is the taco, Mark Carney is the waffle. He's been all over on this issue. He didn't need to commit himself early on because he didn't know what the Americans were planning on doing, because the Americans didn't know what they were planning on doing. So he made, I think, a real tactical error off the top in not buying time until he had a good sense of what the Americans were planning on doing. I agree with my colleagues here who have underlined the importance of standing up to that terrorist regime in Iran, but we need to remember that there are various ways of doing that. There are various ways of engaging, and unfortunately, the Prime Minister has taken different positions at different times without really knowing what the Americans were attempting to do.